Illinois Stories is brought to you by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Illinois Arts Council Agency, and by the supportive viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, welcome to Illinois Stories. I'm Mark McDonald in Springfield at the Lincoln Home Historic Site in front of one of the most photographed houses in America. Of course, you recognize Abraham Lincoln's house, but interestingly, just across the street and down one is another home that housed one of the most important men in American history, and we're just learning really a lot about Julius Rosenwald, aren't we, Tim Townsend? Because he kind of wanted it that way. He was a remarkable businessman, a remarkable philanthropist, but he also wanted to remain anonymous in a lot of ways, didn't he?
That's right, yeah. Julius Rosenwald was born in a home that's now our location of our visitor parking lot here at the historic site, and in 1862, and then in 1869 moved into this house that we luckily and fortunately still have, and spent the next 10 years growing up here in this home.
Went to Springfield High School.
Yes.
Okay,
yep.
so he was a Springfield kid, but he really went to New York to, I guess, to find his fortune, because he knew that there was going to be a lot for him to do, I think.
It seems so, yeah. He was a very ambitious young man, even was involved with the rededication of the Lincoln Tomb, and sold booklets, and we kind of got that bite for the retail world even as a boy here in Springfield, and then of course moved on to bigger and better things.
Yeah, he met a man named Sears, and he and Mr. Sears formed the Sears-Roebuck company. Julius Rosenwald was then to become the CEO and chairman for many years, and that was when Sears was probably the biggest company in America, and they were into the catalog business, which was enormously successful. So all of these millions that he earned, he also really knew how to spend in the right way, didn't he?
Right. He saw needs in the communities in the nation where his money would do the most good, and so again, and he didn't want people to know that he was behind these donations and this credible gift to the nation.
During this program, we're going to talk to a number of people who are familiar with his work. Some of them benefited from his largesse, and we'll learn about Julius Rosenwald. But first, it's interesting that the Park Service has recently renamed this home in his honor, and you've also plaqued it so people that are visiting the neighborhood here can learn more about him.
Right. On February 12th, on Lincoln's birthday, we had a ceremony where we brought folks together and rededicated, and I guess renamed the home, the Rosenwald home, and dedicated this wayside exhibit to let all the hundreds of thousands of people who come to learn about Abraham Lincoln learn also about Julius Rosenwald.
Yeah. Well, let's go inside and let's just mine this subject matter.
Okay.
Huh? Okay, let's go on. Michael Jackson, you've done a lot of background work on Julius Rosenwald.
Yes.
And when this house was dedicated and it was plaqued, you made a presentation about his life and his philanthropy. Sure. Well, I mean, the guy leaves here and goes to New York and meets up with people, and then starts one of the biggest companies in the world. Yeah. So he's a smart guy. We know that.
Yep.
But he happened to be, I guess he was smart at the right time, and he had the right concepts, didn't he?
I think the amazing thing about him from a business standpoint is that he came into a business that was already there. The Sears and Roebuck had started their thing, but Sears was a marketer. Roebuck was really just kind of a watch repairman, and they got something that was bigger than them. And Julius came in at the right time with his brother-in-law, and they bought a half interest in the company in the 1890s. By the early 1900s, Julius has taken over the company as the president, and he's the guy that made Sears the retail giant that it became.
Yeah.
So he had great business acumen.
We know that the catalog businesses are still doing a great business, but the catalog, nobody even conceived of a catalog business at that time until Sears did. Is that right?
Well, Sears and Montgomery Ward, they're all in there about the same time, but he just took it bigger. And Chicago is really a center of that retail business. So he was at the right place at the right time and knew how to put it together.
What really separates him, though, from other magnates is the fact that he came to a conclusion at some point in his life that he wanted to be a social philanthropist. How did that happen?
Well, obviously there's the story of his life as in the Jewish community and his principles of giving, and so that certainly helped him. There was Emil Hirsch was the rabbi in Chicago, and he's one of the kind of the leaders of this intellectual movement at the time, and helping with Jane Addams and Hull House, etc. So he's around other people thinking philanthropy. But on his 50th birthday, Julius Rosenwald celebrated by giving away $750,000 in that time's money, which is a lot, and established that he's going to have a reputation for giving. So, he really became this multimillionaire at 45, and by 50, he's already thinking, how do I give it away?
He had a saying about that very thing, didn't he?
Oh yeah, there was an interesting point he makes. Is he said, "I think it's easier to make $1 million than to figure out how to give it away wisely."
Yeah.
And boy, is that true. He's like, what do I do with this? And so there's a range of things that he did with his money over time, but probably the most exciting part of it was what he did for African Americans and for African American education.
Let's talk about the schools.
Sure. Well, the Tuskegee Institute he got involved with. He met Booker T. Washington, came to Chicago, they spoke, and they really became fast friends. He goes on the board of the Tuskegee Institute, and they had started a little program with schools, and Julius sort of helped them out. And that got going, and it was incredibly successful. And so the little increment that they started in Alabama grows, and basically, ultimately, the Rosenwald Foundation takes over the Rosenwald School program because they just need to ramp it up to scale. And they set up an office in Nashville, and then over about a 15-year period, almost 5,000 schools and other support buildings are constructed, with the Rosenwald Fund generally paying a third of the cost, a third coming from the local community, and another third coming from the state or the local tax base. So what Rosenwald understood about this is that to expand this education, you needed everybody to be in on it. He would subsidize it, get it going, and they sought that money because that was really desirable, and boy, did it work.
5,000 schools for black children in the South.
Yes.
And these would have been schools that opened after the Reconstruction period. And like you say, under Jim Crow laws, these kids were not allowed in white schools, so there was nowhere for them to go.
Yeah, so he was really basically underpinning the educational system, and the statistics are that something like a third of all African American children at the time were studying in a Rosenwald school, hundreds of thousands of people. So it had an incredible impact across the country of raising educational standards for African Americans, and that's the school program. And then you had the other irony, the other program that he supported for African Americans was urban YMCAs. So it was difficult for African Americans to find a place to stay in the city. Rosenwald similarly says, I'll give $25,000 if you raise the rest of the money, and a couple of dozen YMCAs are built across the country.
$25,000 was a pile of cash then.
And then the next part of it is he establishes his Rosenwald funds are scholarships for educational advancement, which reaches to scientists and artists, musicians, etc. And so over another 10-year period, he's dispersing money that's sort of the critical little subsidy money to help the educational achievement and at the advanced level, colleges and beyond. And so you have William E. Du Bois, I think probably, I'm just trying to think of some of the names of some of the famous people that got the grants, and I'm sort of blanking on that.
I remember reading about Langston Hughes was one of them, and it's interesting because he first went to school up in Lincoln.
That's right.
And they say he wrote his first poem in Lincoln, Illinois, so there was a connection there too.
So Langston Hughes, who's a dancer from Katherine Dunham. Was one of the ones.
Yes.
So basically, some of the intellectuals of the black community in the early 20th century were all getting funds from the Julius Rosenwald Foundation.
Wow. Now, and we can't leave without one of the most remarkable museums in the world is located in Chicago. This departs a little bit from his social philanthropy, but he also is responsible for the Museum of Science and Industry, and if anybody's been up there, they know that this is a monolithic museum.
And the story on that is that in the early 20th century, Julius visited Germany, and he went to a similar science museum that he saw in Germany, and he thought, this is really impressive. So that idea stuck with him. When he comes back to Chicago, that idea is germinating, and the former arts building from the Columbian Exposition is sitting on the south side. He lives in Hyde Park. This old building is sitting there, kind of substantial but ignored, and Julius gets behind the effort And something like $11 million of foundation and family money went into creating the Museum of Science and Industry. And the other backstory on it is that they wanted to call it the Rosenwald Museum. And he said, absolutely not. My name doesn't go on it. So that's another part of this story, is the irony of this great social philanthropist who didn't want his name on things. Mm-hmm. He wasn't into the ego of that. He thought it was more selfish. It wasn't as selfish to basically have your name out there. You just took that off. So that was part of his rules. You know, he didn't put his name on things, and his foundation had to go out of business. It was a give while you live philosophy. Yeah. So his standing as a social philanthropist is outstanding for the depth and the breadth of what he gave to support for African Americans, and then the kind of the modesty of how he did it. Mm-hmm. It's a legacy that's been unduplicated.
Thank you.
Sure.
Carolyn Blackwell, Julius Rosenwald did all kinds of good things with his fortune. But I guess people would say one of the primary things he did was he opened a lot of schools, maybe 5,000 schools for black children in the South.
Exactly.
You happened to go to one.
I did.
Where did you go to a Rosenwald school?
A town of 2,000 in Providence, Kentucky. Mm-hmm. Yeah. In 1951, I was 6 years old. In those days, you had to be 6 to go to school. So I entered the first grade at 6 in 1951 and went there for 4 years, first, second, third, and fourth grade to 1954.
And you could have gone longer.
Yes.
I mean, you could have gone through high school,
exactly.
Right? But your family moved.
My family moved, yeah. Actually, it was a school 1 through 12. Yeah, so, and it was a place, I think, where a lot of community things happened. We had a chapel. Actually, we had to go to chapel every day and sing, lift every voice and sing, which is the Negro National Anthem, and then go, you know, back to our classes and start our day.
So when your family moved to Champaign. Your dad, who had gone through a Rosenwald school too, the schools must have been pretty good, because when he moved to Champaign, he went right into college, didn't he?
Went right into the University of Illinois.
And that was hard to get into.
It was. He took one class that at the same time he was going to the University of Illinois at Uni High.
One transition
I forgot
class,
what it was, but yeah.
So he was prepared for college.
He was prepared.
And of course, you felt like you got a good education because you spent your professional life as an educator.
I did. I loved my first through fourth grade. When I got to Champaign in the 5th grade, I was on the honor roll. And then we moved here when actually, I think I was in the 6th grade and I went to IL school. So.
Yeah. So Mr. Rosenwald probably has a pretty special place in your heart, doesn't he?
He does. And I didn't realize that he was born right here in Springfield.
I know.
Yeah.
I know.
And I didn't know he had built 5,000 schools. I thought mine was the only one. Because it was a wonderful experience for me. And I think because it was a community type experience. It wasn't just a school. It was, well, and I later learned also his philosophy of a third, and a third made it that way. He gave a third of his fortune building the school. The African American community put in some sweat equity, or my grandfather was the janitor, and there was another lady who brought, I said, bologna sandwiches and to the school for lunch, you know.
Right. Everybody was invested.
Right, and a third of it, the white community, in books, and I think they paid some of the teachers' salaries.
Well, Carolyn, thank you. It's a great story.
Yes.
Thanks for sharing it with us. Well, the Rosenwald House, while it's used for modern uses, being the administrative office for the Park Service, as you can see by looking at these doors, a lot of this house retains its historic value. So it's a very interesting place to visit. Nancy Gage, you were with the Springfield Federation, or the Jewish Federation of Springfield.
I am.
And Rosenwald was a devout Jewish man, and exhibited a lot of the qualities and the moral fortitude, I guess, that that you would want to see, not only in Jewish people, but in everybody.
In everyone.
But I mean, he was a superb example, was he not, of the values that you would hope that the rest of the world would see in Jewish people.
He absolutely was an example, and the values that he embodied were the values of tikkun olam, which is repairing the world, and tzedakah, which is charity, and it comes from the word justice. And his charitable endeavors and philanthropic endeavors were directed to repairing the world, the 5,000 schools in the South. He was also a major donor to the NAACP after the 1908 race riots.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So we have a lot of Springfield connections aside from the fact that he was born here and lived here until his teens when he moved away.
Yeah. You know, I said this jokingly earlier, you know, he's kind of like the most important guy nobody ever heard of, you know, and it's interesting that now we're going to make an attempt to get people to understand who he was and more about his life. But is that something that you'd like to do too?
It's absolutely something that we'd like to do. It's ironic because in Maimonides, who is a medieval scholar, developed and cited a ladder of giving, and one of the highest rungs of the ladder of giving is anonymous giving. And the other one, which refers back to justice, is if in fact you receive charity, you were also expected to give charity. And I truly believe that the formula for the Rosenwald schools, a third of the community, a third of government, and a third of his money was part and parcel of that. And in growing up, I grew up in Chicago, and growing up, the Museum of Science and Industry was referred to by my mother always with pride as the Rosenwald Museum.
Even though
he did not want his name on it, and that was the story.
Yeah.
And that was the story. So we at the Jewish Federation of Springfield are very, very proud, not only that Rosenwald was born here, but we're proud that we have partnered with our friends in the Black community to raise the profile of Julius Rosenwald in Springfield as
he's a phenomenal man.
He was a phenomenal man, and I think that being involved with the Rosenwald Initiative over the past 3 years and watching it grow and being part of it and seeing how it's evolved to having a Rosenwald house, we had no idea that anything like this was possible. So we're very proud to be part of it.
Thank you. Catherine, it's interesting that Abraham Lincoln and Julius Rosenwald lived on 8th Street, not at the same time, but lived on 8th Street in the same century.
Right.
But you know, the people then at that time, people that were public spirited, shared certain traits. And it's interesting to look at the two men and see what similarities they had. And that's one of the things that you thought about, wasn't it?
Right. I was tasked to look into similarities between Mr. Lincoln and Mr. Rosenwald. And I did find, thanks to the Abraham Lincoln Center for Character Development, that they had made a list of personality traits for Mr. Lincoln. And so I went through that list, and there were many that Rosenwald also exhibited. And the one that stuck with me the most was humility, because Mr. Lincoln was a very humble person. And so was Mr. Rosenwald. Even though he was a millionaire, perhaps even a billionaire by today's standards, he was a very humble person. He did not want his name to be on any of the good philanthropic things that he did, even though he helped to build some 5,000 plus schools. They were called Rosenwald schools because of his funding for the project, but they also were named for, you know, whatever was appropriate for the town. But he really did not want his name to be associated with it. the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago is a wonderful museum.
Oh, my goodness.
And he was the money behind it, but it doesn't have his name anywhere on it, and you'd have to know that to know that. He wanted the people to take ownership and take pride in the things that he did, and he said if his name was on it, people would look to him when he wanted the people to be proud of whatever and take advantage of. He, with the Wabash Street Y in Chicago, one of the first YMCAs for African Americans. He was the man behind that, but his name isn't on it. So he was a very humble person. Much like Mr. Lincoln, he thought that everyone had the ability to rise, and he felt that the way that Negroes, the term at the time, could rise and improve themselves would be through education, and hence the construction of schools. So I think that was a similarity between him and Mr. Lincoln too. Mr. Lincoln only had like a third grade education, but he became, President of the United States. And he learned from a whole bunch of other different ways. You don't necessarily have to always go to college.
Right.
Life is a very good teacher, as well. So I thought that was a interesting connection between those two.
Thank you, Catherine.
You're welcome.
Jim Lewis, you had the opportunity to work for, 9 or 10 years in the state of Mississippi when you were a much younger man.
Yes.
Maybe one of your first jobs.
It was my first.
But you were aware of the Rosenwald schools, even though they weren't still in operation. What was your story?
In the summer of 1965, I worked in a Head Start center. That was the first year that the government had Head Start. And each day I would walk from the house where I lived past the Rosenwald School on the way to the church where we had the Head Start Center. And it was explained to me, there was this building, it was an old wooden building, unpainted, not being used, just an old building, but everybody expressed their respect for it. And the basis for the respect was that this was the beginning of the reestablishment of schools in Mississippi for the African American community. These were their first schools since Reconstruction. There had been public schools for African Americans during Reconstruction. When Reconstruction came to an end, the white people took control and closed all the public schools. So this was the beginning of the new era of public school, of schools for African Americans.
That was a considerable gap in education opportunity, wasn't it?
That was a gap of a good 50 years.
Oh, man.
40, 50 years without any form of public education and stuff. And I then went on to work, by the way, in desegregating schools. As a lawyer, I supervised about 30 school desegregation cases. Education is critical to the strength of a community, and that's why there was so much respect for this school, which had been the beginning of the reestablishment of education.
So the house has been renamed and plaqued, but there's a chance that this effort could go further. There's legislation pending in Congress that could create a Rosenwald National Historic Park, and that would allow people to go inside the Rosenwald house and learn about his remarkable philanthropy. With another Illinois Story in Springfield, I'm Mark McDonald. Thanks for watching.
Illinois Stories is brought to you by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Illinois Arts Council Agency, and by the support of viewers like you. Thank you.